Jessica Hochman is a pediatrician and a mother of 3. Dr. Jessica and I had a very important discussion that I think all current and future parents should hear. I don't know if it's ever been as hard as it is today to raise children. The social media mommy mob, the vaccine mandates, the push towards transgender children, hormone blockers, and the phenomena of politics in literally everything have made it overwhelming, to say the least. I hope this conversation helps you lower the temperature. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're a pediatrician. You're a mom of 3 kids. You have a way about you that is so calm. You always talk about lowering the temperature, and I think our country needs to hear from people like you. There's just been so much public distress in our health practitioners because of what has been going on over the last few years. And so I do feel for you, but I'm also proud of you because you remain honest and attentive and caring. And I learned so much from you over the years about just generally cooling down the temperature. And when I think about you, I don't think about you as a political person at all. I think of you as a person who really just wants people to thrive and children to thrive.
Genuinely, thank you so much for having me here. It really is an honor. And I would say I'm proud of you for spearheading these conversations that are difficult. And as far as being a doctor, I still really like what I do. I've always liked what I do. And I don't like to complain about it because it's my passion, taking care of these kids.
So one of the things that I learned over the last 10 years since being a parent is that the Twitter mob or the mommy mob is one of the scariest places on planet Earth.
It may be.
And, I remember before having my first child, I would read all these books and I would just try to perfect the system and make sure that I follow the manual on how to raise a perfect child and how to be a perfect parent, which, looking back now after having 3 children, I admit it's impossible. It's an impossible task. But I think that people don't realize how difficult it is to expect that there's going to be some sort of manual and actually adhere to this manual. And so in this era of social media and books and information, many parents feel like they have to follow specific rules all the time.
Absolutely. I think it's awful in many ways because I think nobody has it perfect, right? Nobody's the perfect parent. Nobody has an easy child. I mean, some are easier than others, but it adds on so much stress to think about, oh my goodness, baby-led weaning. You're right, diaper. When do you get your kids out of diapers? Do you do the boot camp? Do you do gentle toilet training? Do you let them do it on their own? Do you do, in terms of how to feed them? It's very stressful for new parents. And so I appreciate that because I do think in the end, the less that we pay attention to social media and how to parent, the better off we are.
One of the things that you always say is take a chill pill. Things will be okay. You don't have to follow, every single, direction that you read about online. And we're seeing more and more of this phenomena where, parents are expected to just follow the rules of the outsider as opposed to really lean in and understand their child and raise a child in a way that is good for them, not necessarily good for whatever manual was published by somebody who never even met the kid.
No, absolutely. I think that's beautifully said. The parental instinct, I think, is so important. When I see families in my office and they seem extra worried, I really want to make sure that I pay attention to what they're saying and understand why they're worried, because oftentimes they know the answer or they'll lead me to the answer. But I agree. I think that it's really hard for parents now with all the input and from the external sources rather than just relying on your own thoughts, being guided by your own gut instinct.
I remember this one time, I went on one of those mommy blogs, those evil places that I describe hell.
Yes.
And it was right after, I'm a working parent. I do admit I feed my children Kraft mac and cheese. It's probably not the healthiest thing in the world, but it's also not the end of the world.
No.
And I read this comment by one of the parents saying, my husband fed my child Kraft mac and cheese, and I think I should leave him because he's a horrible dad. And all the moms are like, you're right, he's horrible, horrible human being, horrible.
Oh my goodness. No, I mean, I think about it. When I was a kid, I was raised on, I got plenty of fast food and I'm still here to talk about it, right? Yeah, I know it's very stressful for parents, and there's so much more to parenting than feeding them, organic, grass-fed, hormone-free foods. While those things are, if parents like to do it, that's great. But I do think in the end, all of these pressures are very stressful for parents. And the hard part is it takes away from your relationship with your child. It takes away, I think, from how much you enjoy being a parent, which ultimately is the most important.
Yeah. I mean, how amazing it is to be able to raise kids with less anxiety, right? I mean, if a parent has all this anxiety,
Yes.
I think it's worse for them to have a parent with all this anxiety than a parent who feeds them Kraft mac and cheese every once in a while or whatever it is.
I would agree. I would
Yeah.
agree. I think in this climate in particular, if you can raise your child with, everybody has anxiety, but if you can keep it to a minimum, you're really doing them a favor. I think it's a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think so much of what we're experiencing right now is there is a narrative that physicians are expected to repeat, and there is the alternative narrative that physicians may agree with, but they're whispering.
Yes.
Because they don't want to experience any sort of backlash. And one of the things I always say is when I think of physicians, when I grew up, generally you guys were the geeks with the,
Still am.
with the faces in the books and
Yes,
not really
yeah.
the ones who want to, run against the herd and, create controversy and,
Right.
Be social justice warriors or be, patriot warriors or whatever it is. And so it's just put you guys in this awkward situation where so much of politics and culture is now creeping into your own practices. And it's just, again, it's just very difficult to navigate. Another example that I want to bring up is this, fat and obese is beautiful, which, as a parent, I really struggle with that narrative. I don't want my children to think that fat and obese is beautiful. I want my kids to think that healthy is beautiful. And so too skinny and anorexic is not beautiful. And too fat is not beautiful either. And, we want kids to feel comfortable in their bodies, but we also want them to be accountable for their bodies and accountable for their health. And, COVID is a perfect example where people who were overweight generally did not fare as well as, folks who were in good shape. And so I think that if you tell a 7-year-old or 10-year-old, a 14-year-old that no matter how much weight they gain, it's not going to matter, I think that's a false and it's a terrible thing because it's just going to be even more difficult for them to lose weight as they get older. And I'm just wondering, as a pediatrician, have you experienced any of those kinds of issues in your practice? And also as a mom, what are your thoughts on that?
So are you referring to the advertisements that we see? Okay.
The advertisements that we see, whether it's Lululemon and Gap and Target, I think it's also in the schools. It's for sure on social media because anything evil is on social media. It's all over TikTok.
Okay, so a couple of thoughts I have. The first I'll say, I actually am in the camp where I am all for body positivity. And what I mean by that is I think it's so hard to be a teenager. It's so hard to have your body change. And I think that if we can do something as a society to make people feel more comfortable about their bodies, I actually think that's a good thing. So I could say, I remember when I was a teenager, and as you pointed out, most of the ads were really thin women. Mm-hmm. And I remember as a teenager really feeling like I should be thinner, I should be looking like those women. And so I do think that encouraging people to feel good about themselves mm-hmm. I support that. I think that's a good part of the movement. However, I think I don't want to confuse the message that being overweight is healthy, because I do think it's important to talk about health in the sense that eating well and exercise is a healthy way to live. And so I don't know, like that message can be mixed together, but I want to encourage body positivity without losing the message to my patients, to society, that exercise and eating well is a good thing to do.
So how do you do that?
How do I do that? Oh gosh.
Yeah.
I think honestly in my office, I'm very sensitive. I never talk about body image because I don't think that's important. Everybody has different body types. We all come in different shapes and sizes, but I'm more related to health. Mm-hmm. I talk about why I want them to be healthy because you're less likely to have heart disease, high cholesterol, kidney issues later on, arthritis, joint disease. So I do think that message is important. But I try to meet the families where they're at. Some people are more receptive to these conversations and some are less, and so I respect that.
When bringing my kids in
Yes.
to my kid's pediatrician, there's like a chart.
Yes.
You're at the 90th percentile. I mean, like, I don't know if that stops at a certain age because I can't remember the last time I've seen one of those charts.
Yes.
But there is a point where you look at a chart, and let's say you have a 12-year-old and they're 30 pounds overweight.
Yes.
Do you say something to the family, or is that now considered offensive because you don't want to fat shame someone? And then
No, never shame.
Right?
Never. Yeah, right. I never like to. It's not in me to, and I don't feel that way. I don't want anyone
Right,
to
and
feel
it's not
shamed.
productive either to shame someone.
No, but it's more that I want to be there for them. If I show them the charts and we'll talk about weight, and if I can help them, I want to help them. I want to send them to the right resources. I don't think it can be ignored as a pediatrician because honestly, if I don't say something to them, who's going to say something to them about their health?
Right, I mean, especially when there is this, bizarre culture right now that is over-advocating, again, for, all of these issues that might not even be that good for these kids.
Right. I mean, I think if people look at the ads and it makes them feel more comfortable or it makes them feel better about themselves, that's one thing. But I don't want to conflate that it's the same as health.
Right.
Because I think we're not being honest if we say that being severely overweight is healthy.
Yeah, it's harder to run, it's harder to recover.
Yes.
I mean, it's harder, and not to mention that should they choose to lose weight when they're older, like I mentioned earlier, I think it just makes it much, much more difficult.
Absolutely. No, I think during COVID, we saw this too. A lot of kids gained a lot of weight just from being inactive, not being at school, not playing in their sports. So it's an important issue.
So speaking of over-advocating and when it comes to sensitive topics, I
Yes.
wanted to bring up the issue of how do we remain compassionate and thoughtful when it comes to the issue of transgender,
Okay.
and specifically with children, but also how do we remain rational and caring of the majority and all the folks that are around the kids who are not necessarily transgender or have gender dysphoria. There is a video that has gone viral recently with a Yale professor talking about how these gender journeys are going to start at age 3. It's mind-boggling to me that people are having these conversations with a straight face because, I have a 4-year-old, and if she has to make a decision of what to even eat for lunch, mommy is going to intervene and say, no, Skittles and M&Ms are not a lunch, right? And so I don't know how a 4-year-old is going to be able to decide what gender there are, but sadly, we're living in a culture where serious adults with degrees and multiple letters after their degrees are talking about having little children change their sex or determine anything about sex.
But I think there's two different issues here. I think there's the social component, and there's where we allow children to be free to express themselves, to dress how they want, to feel comfortable doing things that aren't gender typical. I think that I support, and I think that's not harming anybody. I think where I take issue is when it comes to the area of, like when we talk about the social issues, that's more of a parenting issue. That's less of a doctor issue. But when we talk about things like adding a medication or surgery, that's when I get uneasy because I don't think there's a lot of science to back up transitioning kids when they're when prepubertal age. I don't think there's a lot of good data to support that it's helpful. And in fact, it may be more harmful. And so I take a lot of pause, and I know that people feel differently and there's a lot of different perspectives, but my perspective is that medicating and performing surgeries on kids before puberty, I don't support it. Because I read a lot about harms. I just read something about, there's a woman that she's transgender herself and she performs surgeries, and she was noticing that kids that are that have not gone through puberty yet, if they take puberty blockers, they're more likely to have their sexual development stunted and they might not ever achieve orgasm in their life. And there's things like, when I hear messages like that, it really concerns me. So I'm of the mindset that I'm very open to kids socially transitioning if they want to wear different clothes, if they want to be called something different. That doesn't bother me so much because I don't think it's doing any harm. But where I take a stance is medications and surgery.
I think I agree with you that when it comes to the hormone blockers and the puberty blockers, the surgeries, that is the scary element of this conversation. But there is another scary element to this conversation, I think, that comes before the medication part of it, and that is just what our society is doing with regards to this issue. I remember 30 years ago when I was a kid, when we all went through these phases where, we were vegan or we were, punk rock with the fishnets and, the funky shoes and whatever. Bizarre behavior is part of being a teen. And I feel like it's just what we need to do. We got to push the boundaries. We got to do crazy things. We got to be heard and seen. And it just feels to me that we're kind of becoming conductors of the punk rock phase, except it's a much, more disruptive and possibly have irreversible damage, even on kids that are not involved in it. Like kids are getting punished if they're not calling the boy or the girl but the way they're supposed to be called. And doctors are expected to address their patients based on whatever pronouns these folks are deciding that they want to be addressed, even though it's not necessarily the composition of their bodies. How do we remain compassionate? How do we remain understanding? How do we remain supportive without eliminating all boundaries and all norms and, frankly, rational thought?
This is a great question. So I think what I would say to that, in terms of remaining compassionate, I agree with you that that's the big picture, is that we want to teach our kids how to be compassionate, how to be kind, just be nice to one another, and that would solve so many problems. But in terms of the children and how to raise them, I honestly think the more we trust that parents know what's best, the more that we leave this to the parents to decide on how to raise their kids, what to talk about, I actually think the better off we are. I think that there's so much societal pressure. It's coming from the schools. It's coming from, the politicians. And I do believe that most of us, I do believe it's well-meaning. I'm an optimist. I believe that most humans are well-meaning. I think parents are well-meaning. And I think parents want to do the right thing. But I think so much, back to what we were talking about before, is that parents have to trust their gut. And I think if we lean into that, we'll all be better off. And I think the kids will be better off.
So we have a friend that has a little boy that likes to wear his sister's girly pajamas.
Yes.
And sometimes the child would show up with the girly pajamas even to school. And so I remember that your and my reaction was, well, just let them do what they want to do, right?
Yes.
Is that something that you're seeing in your practice, and just what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, yesterday at work, I saw a kid come in a Spider-Man costume. I saw a kid come in as a princess. I think it's great. I wish adults were a little more fun, to be honest, like kids are. I wish we used our imagination a little bit more. I don't mind that at all. I think that at the same time, if a parent sends their child to a religious school where they have uniforms, for example, and that's required, I also think that's okay. It really comes down to, for me, how the parent wants to parent their child. If they don't mind and they want to be open to costumes and more play, I think that's wonderful. And if they have to wear a soccer uniform and they can't dress a certain way, then I respect that as well.
Yeah, it's funny because when I think about the friend and the girly pajamas, now this boy wants to be a cowboy. And so kind of like grew out of that phase. And I mean, and that's like a perfectly normal thing when kids, experiment and experience life, in their own creative way. But we are kind of living in this society where the helicopter parents feel like they have to spring into action. He wants to wear a tutu. Let's see if maybe, let's take him to a gender clinic, which is something that I want to ask you a little bit more about. But I think there's this kind of like system where you feel like you have to propel the whole thing forward.
Right.
And, maybe just kind of like you say, take a chill pill and just like take a step back.
Yeah, I think that's my answer to a lot of things in medicine, that it's often, I think, a good answer to go slow, that rushing can sometimes lead to worse outcomes. So when it comes to kids, yeah, absolutely, let them dress up, take a step back, and see how things evolve. And I do think that the parents that rush to clinics, gender clinics, I do think that they're trying to do the right thing. I think they just want to be accepting and open-minded. But I do agree. I think the better approach would be to go slower.
So what happens
most of the time?
So first of all, I'm just curious, do you have kids in your practice that are experiencing either gender dysphoria or transgender? And if so, is this a new phenomena? Like 5 years ago, was it the same or the numbers increasing?
Okay, it's a good question. I think I've always had some kids that have been that have experienced gender dysphoria. I can think of 2 children in my practice that identified as transgender. In the last few years, though, the number has definitely increased. I think we have maybe 6 non-binary patients and maybe another half dozen that identify as transgender, and some that are, questioning, they're not sure. I do have to say, though, that I have not been asked by any of those patients for medications. None of them have asked me about getting surgery. So, that begs the question, like, how much should we be upset about this? Because, again, if people are just questioning and they're not sure and they're taking time to figure things out and they're not doing anything that's irreversible, I think that's okay. As you pointed out, teenagers often go through, are trying to figure things out. It's a tough time. And so I'm sympathetic to that.
What happens if they come to you and say that, they're ready to transition? Would you give them medication? Do you give them medication, or do you generally send them to a gender clinic? And can you tell me what is a gender clinic? I'm just assuming that those who go and work for gender journey clinics are usually people who are very pro the gender journey transformation, right? Like, who chooses to work for those? And so what does that look like?
So I have not been to a gender clinic since I was in residency. And I remember attending one at UCLA, and it was really comprehensive. They had an endocrinologist on the team. They had a social worker on the team. They had a urologist on the team. So it was really sort of a full service place for people to go that were experiencing gender dysphoria. So I haven't been to one in a long time, but from what I read, I have some questions. I don't know. I mean, I think what's hard is, as a pediatrician, that is where I would send somebody, because I'm not knowledgeable about hormones and treatment, and that's not my expertise. But for example, I just read in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, they were quoting a study looking at the University of Seattle, and they found that within 12 months of somebody being referred to a gender affirming clinic, 66% of patients referred were started on a hormone.
At what age?
It didn't. I don't recall.
But these are minors. They're not, 18.
They're minors. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're likely starting puberty blockers and all of that before.
I think either you're right, either like a estrogen, testosterone, or a puberty blocker. So, and I think what's tricky is that we're sort of delving into territory that doesn't have great scientific data, and that's what I'm about. I want to see good data that if we're going to do this, that it's helpful, because I err as a physician to do less. I like to, I abide by the mantra, do no harm. And so I would hate to be on the wrong side of history on this one, where we intervene inappropriately and something unfortunate happens that's irreversible to a kid 5-10 years down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I know I changed my mind about all kinds of things since I was a teenager.
Yeah.
So it's so hard to really find yourself and know all these answers. And again, I mean, sex, sexuality, all of those things are really big concepts that we're saddling little children or teenagers with lifelong decisions.
I think about why is it that with my kids, I don't let them get married. My 6-year-old has someone that she has a crush on in school. And why would I not let her settle down with him at this point? Or, my kids get temporary tattoos. Why is it that we don't let them get real tattoos at this point? There's big decisions that I think are better made when you give it time. I think little kids and teenagers don't always know what they want. And so I tend to err on giving things time to make the best decisions.
There is an element that we have not talked about, and the element is there are the kids who have the transgender dysphoria or whatever gender dysphoria that they're dealing with, and I am compassionate about that. But I am also a mama bear, and I also care about my children, and I do feel like my children are impacted frankly, by the tyranny of the minority. And so
Yes.
if I have to send my kids to Walt Disney, and because of the minority that is being tyrannical over pushing this transgender princess stuff, now I have to deal with explaining to my kids what is this issue of sex at age 7, which I'm not
Right.
ready to do and I don't want to do. And I don't think it's appropriate to do. And so the reason I get upset is because the majority of the population now has to, frankly, shove it down the throats of children who don't have to deal with these complex issues because they weren't born with those issues. But I feel like as a parent, I have to be forced to do it, you know?
So you feel like it's coming into your world when you're not looking
It's
for it.
in my world,
Yeah.
it's in my children's world, and
Yeah.
I don't want it to be in my children's world right now. So why do I have to put it in my children's world? Because there are a few kids who have this issue.
Right.
And so there is a difference between telling my child, if there is a kid who is different from you in your class, you should be nice to them, you should smile at them, you should have compassion. There's a difference between me telling my children to do that for all kids and all other people versus now Disney is doing Transgender Princess.
Right.
Now the cover of National Geographic has, a transgender child. Now when we go to Target, there are binders hanging right by the socks and the underwear. And like now, this is not just a matter of, well, there are a few minority kids who are going through, whatever they're going through. Now, I have to actually be saddled with, and my children have to be saddled with talking about sex and sexualization
Right.
and issues that I just strongly don't feel like my kids are ready to talk about.
I kind of take it back to, because there's no perfect answer here, and because people have such different ideologies, they have such different views when it comes to religion, sexuality, how to raise their children. I tend to think the answer is more about having parents teach their children, relying less on the schools to do it, but relying on parents to do it, because I do think at the end of the day, parents know best for their children.
I wish it was more the case where we would just leave it to the families and the individuals to, wrestle with it, and we just teach kindness all around and compassion all around without necessarily saying, you have to live with this, you have to look at it right now at age kindergarten.
Yeah.
We talk about the drag queens that are brought into schools, and that is just like inappropriate.
I do have to say, though, my kids are in LAUSD. It's the second largest public school system in the country. And I haven't had them come home yet with things that they've been taught, about gender. I'm sure it will come, but in fairness to LAUSD, I haven't heard it yet.
It's the woke rich schools that start with it first.
Okay. I think my overarching feeling is just we should just be leaving the kids alone.
Yeah.
When it comes to things like gender, when they're younger, when they're littler, let's just let them be kids.
Yeah. One of the things that I talked to Deborah So about, who's
I love her.
Yeah,
Yes.
I love her, and she's written a book on this issue and has
Yes.
spoken, is that it's so difficult to be just a regular kid these days. And the reason it's difficult is because our society is really celebrating the victim in whatever way possible. And I think we've so overcorrected to a point that now we pretty much give a voice only to the victim. And my concern is when children are hearing that unless you're a victim, you do not have a voice, then they engage in what I call oppression Olympics.
Yes.
And so it's like, well, if I'm a white male, who's going to want to hear what I have to say if I'm not any sort of minority? And so it seems like this new era of gender dysphoria or sex dysphoria is almost like a way for some of these kids to feel like they can be heard or feel like, they have some sort of identity in a status. And we need to be careful. I mean, this is not a conversation, this I'm saying to you as a mom. We need to be careful to describe this world that we live in as a world that unless you're a victim of some sort, unless you're a minority of some sort, you don't have a place and you don't have to say. And that is really what worries me. And when you talk about how you have an increase in kids who are experiencing, the gender dysphoria, I question whether is it that, okay, finally they feel comfortable to be who they want to be, or is it that our society has pushed more and more kids to be that because, it's just become part of this trend?
I mean, I think that probably maybe there's a little bit of truth in all of that. I think there's definitely kids that are transgender, definitely kids that likely feel more comfortable now to say how they feel, which I think is great. When it comes to kids and attention-seeking behavior, I really think parenting can go a long way. I really try to tell my kids, their gender is interesting, but not that interesting.
Right.
I want them to be known for their accomplishments, for their interests, for what they succeed at. And so I really try to impress that upon my kids. I get really excited if they make a cool new Lego formation, or if my daughter got a good grade on a test, or she studied hard and she, she was proud of herself at the end of that. And I think that's really, as a parent, what I would encourage us to do.
Yeah, I mean, incidentally, as you speak about it, I think about how it is quite vain to really focus so much on like the physical. It's so much of this, gender conversation is about how people look at you,
right,
versus how you accept you, right?
Right.
And so,
right. I mean, I think gender is interesting to an extent, but
right.
There's so much more to a person, that I would prefer to emphasize.
Yeah. So speaking of helpful tools for parents,
yes.
One of the things we love to talk about is a video that PragerU has made a few years ago called Vitamin N, is a vitamin no.
Okay.
Right. And so how important it is to sometimes tell your kids no. Right. And so
I love telling my kids no.
It's one of my hobbies personally. But I think, parents forget how important it is that their role is to, set boundaries and give love and send boundaries. So I brought you a little gift that maybe you can use for your practice.
Okay, great.
So I give you a little vitamin no. Okay. The next vitamin I have for you is a new vitamin that I've made up. I'm the mean mom. Vitamin B, vitamin board.
Okay, all right.
Okay. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about vitamin board because I have a theory that being bored is actually really good for you.
I agree.
I think it's good for you as an adult because it creates space for creativity.
Absolutely.
But I think it's especially good for kids. And I think kids are lacking a vitamin board. And so whenever my kids complain that they're bored, I'm like, yes, that's good for you. And the reason I think being bored is really good for you is because you learn how to, think and how to create space in your own brain and develop ideas, but also just get comfortable with yourself.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think kids aren't bored enough. When my kids tell me they're bored, I just send them outside. And honestly, if you give it 5-10 minutes, they're often making up a play, or they're making a fort, or they're playing creatively, and I love it. I do think it's really hard because we're competing with social media, and I think it's really hard for parents to avoid. And I think what's so tricky with that is, media, it really activates the dopamine pathways of your brain, and it's addicting, and it's hard to find something as entertaining in life when you're constantly on social or on media. So I think about my kids, like if they spend a lot of time on media, it's really hard for me to get them to go on a hike, for example. It just makes the day-to-dayness less interesting. So I would agree. I think more kids need to be more bored.
Yeah, I think
it's a good thing.
It's social media, it's the games, it's the video games. I'm hearing that a lot of kids are having a really hard time falling asleep at night because they can't just calm down. And so I don't know if any of the kids in your practice are dealing with that issue as well. But what's your answer to parents who ask you, like, what do I do vis-a-vis the video games? We can't eliminate it entirely because we don't want our kids to be complete outcasts.
Right.
But how do we have, a good amount of boundaries when it comes to that?
So I'm a big believer in quality over quantity. So I try to have my kids watch the older, slower moving, old movies. I think that's better for their brains. And I like to take breaks. I think it's really, really important that they're not on on media whenever they want. So in our house, for example, we do 2 nights a week. We watch movies. We're definitely not perfect. They watch more than I would like, but we definitely have limits before
What about
bed.
the video games and all of that stuff?
I think video games are tough. We don't have video games in our house, but I do think that they're addicting. So I think parents just need to be aware of it. I think it's a tall order and probably an impossible ask that we don't have kids watch any media, but I do think parents should be aware that they are addicting, and it does, I think, detract from creativity, as you pointed out.
Yeah, creativity, ability to just kind of self-regulate yourself, and falling asleep, finding ways to problem solve. I mean, how do you problem solve? I mean, this is something for adults.
Yes.
How do you problem solve? How do you come up with creative ways? How do you get comfortable with yourself if you leave yourself no room for to be in your own brain and develop thoughts.
I agree. I remember in high school, I had this wonderful Spanish teacher named Mr. Dagger. And I used to do my homework sometimes in his classroom during lunch. And he would just sit there and stare. And I said, Mr. Dagger, what are you doing? And he said, well, he goes, I'm never bored because I have my brain.
Yeah.
He goes, I'm not bored. I'm perfectly happy and entertained because I have my brain.
Right.
And I thought about that a lot because how cool to be like that, to be able to just be happy and content with yourself.
Yeah. So, okay, the cheapest vitamin and most valuable vitamin on the market now is vitamin board. Okay.
Yes. You know who else, as I'm thinking, who else I think about is Thomas Edison, the greatest inventor of all time, arguably. Yeah. And I think all these inventions, he invented sound and photography and the light bulb, and it all came from him just being bored, just using, following his creative thoughts.
Yeah.
So I'll prescribe this.
Prescribe.
Sure.
Okay,
Yes,
I have one more for you to prescribe, but this one I actually think you should. So the two are mostly to prescribe for kids.
Okay.
Though this could go for the adults, but this is for the parents. So my version of vitamin C is vitamin chill pill.
Okay.
Vitamin chill. So I'll let you talk about that one because that's the one you like to talk about.
Oh, well, hopefully I say it in a nice way, but not making anybody feel bad. But yeah, I do think it's a lot of people are suffering from anxiety. I think probably a lot has to do with all the inputs from social media. There's never a break in a bad story or something to be worrying about. And so I think it's really unfortunate. It's hard to figure out the balance on when to worry and when not to worry. And so, I think probably the easiest advice at first would be to spend less time on Twitter and spend less time on these media outlets. I think that's a really good place to start.
Yeah, and more time just with your kids, right? Getting to know their needs and spending time with them and
although that doesn't always chill me out, but sometimes it does the opposite.
Right.
Or just hanging out with your kids, good quality time. I personally love being outdoors. I think that's a great way to relax and just sort of knowing yourself. For some people, it's meditation. For some people, it's hanging out with a good friend or going on a date with your spouse. But I do think whatever it is, whatever it takes for somebody to relax, I do think that's important. I think it makes your quality of life so much better if you're not always worrying.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Always good to chat with you.
Always.
I hope this has been helpful to our audience. I know many of them have kids, many of them want to have kids, and we just want to have more rational parents around. And that's why I wanted to have this real talk conversation with you. So thanks a bunch.
Thank you for having me.